I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's class on chess tactics. We're going to cover, I'm taking examples from the book by Siegbert Tarrasch called The Game of Chess. He has a whole section on middle game attacks against the opposing king. Tonight's subject is the underdefended back row, allowing various kinds of checkmates on your opponent's home row or back row. But before we get started, I'd just like to say my name is Jim McLaughlin. I'm a chess master. I've been playing chess since I was in high school, about 50 years now. I'd like each person to introduce themselves and say how long they've been playing chess. You learned before I did. I was taught when I was in grade school by my uncle. But I didn't get serious about it until I got to high school and all the kids were playing chess. So that's when I started, really started. Okay, well, again, the back row mate. So this first example just gets the idea across. White to move and win, and of course it's rook to d8 checkmate. Now the next example is almost as simple. So we'll run through it quickly. Then we'll get into some more interesting ones. Now in this case, we have the double rooks on the D file. Black has the double rooks on the A file. Unfortunately for black, it's white's move. So again, it's just rook to the 8th check, rook takes checkmate. So that's the general idea. Now we get into some more interesting examples. In this example, it's white to play and win. You can see that the white rooks are lined up, one on E3 and one on E1, giving a lot of power along that E file. Of course, there's a pawn in the way. There's two black center pawns, one at E6 and D5. The queen defends the pawns, as does the rook on E8. But notice that the rook on E8 is only defended once by the queen. So if we can break through there, we would threaten rook takes rook, winning the rook. So that kind of gives us an idea. Now I'd like to put it out there to the audience. Who would suggest the winning move for white? What do you think is the winning move?
Crazy idea.
Okay.
Queen takes E5.
Well, queen takes D5. Black can answer queen takes queen, and you can't really break through. Yeah. So you can't. This does not involve a sacrifice. This example, you got to put pressure on those two center pawns. How can we bring another piece of pawn to attack those center pawns?
C3 to C4.
That's the correct move. So obviously the threat is pawn takes pawn, and black can't respond pawn takes pawn because that pawn on E6 is pinned by the threat of rook takes rook check. So that's the threat. It's not totally clear what the best move is for black, but the author helps us out in this example. He has black make an immediate blunder. So let's do the blunder and then we'll figure out the win. Okay, pawn takes pawn. He would have done better to defend that pawn with maybe the rook on F7 to D7 and not do pawn takes pawn. Anyway, now we do have a winning combination. What's white's winning move here?
Rook takes E6.
Yeah. Okay, so the threat, of course, is rook takes rook, and we're threatening the queen. So black responds rook takes rook, and now what's the move?
E8.
And queen back. Now what? Queen takes queen. That's the correct way to do it, leading to checkmate. Very good. Okay, now in this position, it's more complicated than what we've looked at. Let's analyze the position a little bit. White is obviously the attacker. The queen and bishop are attacking that knight on c6. as is the white rook on c1. Now the white bishop on e3 is not attacking anything, nor is the knight on f3. But notice that there's a rook on f1 that can slide over to d1, where it's protected by the queen and the rook, and it would threaten the black queen, and the black queen would have to retreat somewhere. So that's pretty much it from white's point of view. There are no pawns interacting, so no pawn moves on either side make any sense. Now let's look at black's resources. Black's looks like his knight on c6 looks like it's well defended. He's got a pawn on b7 protecting the knight. He's got the knight on e7, and he's got the queen. The big drawback in black's position is the fact that his bishop hasn't moved from its starting position and blocks the rooks. So the rooks are not protecting each other. That gives us, as white, the opportunity to strike now. If it was black's move, he could defend everything quite easily just by moving that bishop on c8 to e6. Then the rooks would protect each other. The bishop would help protect the f7 pawn, and black would be perfectly safe. So white to play and win. We've looked at most, the other thing worth noting, look at the bad king position for black. He's in the corner behind 3 pawns, and our goal is to get a rook or a queen on that back rank and deliver checkmate. So keep that in mind. Who would suggest a winning move for white?
From f to d1.
Yeah, that's the right move. It forces the queen back, and now the rook is lined up on that rook on d8, which is, once the queen moves away, it will only be defended by the knight on c6, right? Okay, so the queen just drops back 1 square to e6, and where she can continue to defend the knight on c6. Go ahead.
Again, knight to
g5. All right, let's look at that. Knight to g5. Obviously, the queen's going to have to move unless black wants to do rook takes rook check for some reason. And I don't think that would really help him, because the other rook comes over and may be able to go up to d8 anyway. It might help him, though. Yeah, I think rook takes rook check would help him. In this case, black does rook takes rook check to, when you're defending, it helps to exchange off the opponent's pieces. So that's one major idea. So let's do that. Rook takes. Yeah, let's look at g4. We're threatening to trade queens anyway, and we're on the white rook. I think white wins in this case, though, with the move bishop takes knight. Now what should black do? The threat is rook to d8. Huh?
Actually, wouldn't a better move right there be knight to f7 check?
Well, then his king comes over and can threaten to do king takes knight. I like the threat of rook to d8 threatening an immediate checkmate. And don't forget, we just took a piece off the board. And if queen takes queen, the bishop takes back and we're a piece up. So let's look at this a little deeper. What can black do? This threat is rook to d8 check. Yeah, knight takes bishop. That's good. That's good. Okay, now we can't do queen takes knight because he would have queen takes rook checkmate. But we could do rook to d8 check, and what would black do?
Knight takes rook.
Okay, look, it opened up a nice line for our queen. and we'd get checkmate. So apparently, queen to g4 is not sufficient. We have to move our queen somewhere. But I got an idea. Let's try queen to f6. Here, the queen guards the d8 square. After bishop takes knight, knight takes, bishop takes knight, knight takes, then rook doesn't work because I would have knight to, well, it might work. Rook down check, I do queen takes rook, he'd have knight takes pawn check, forking the king and queen. Let's look at that. So, bishop, it looks like in this case, bishop takes knight looks like it wins 2. The threat is rook to d8, and if knight takes, this is kind of a cute move. Here, if knight takes, we still have queen to e8 checkmate, and if queen takes, which I was thinking I could defend, he has knight takes pawn check. Yeah, and he should win that game. Because after, he should win because the black king position is open even though the material is about balance. The remaining bishop and queen ought to figure out a way to win some pawns by checking the king. All right, well, rook takes rook didn't work too good. Let's see. All right. So here, we're saying here. Let's take, I don't see a defense. Well, let's do that again. Rook takes rook check, rook takes rook. Now we tried queen to g4 and we tried queen to f6. I don't think there's any other moves. So I'm going to say whoever said knight to g5, that's a good move. Let's go back and see what the author says should happen. Here's the winning variation that the author gives. Bishop takes knight. He's destroying the guard of the d8 rook. Knight takes, wait a second. Knight takes. Now, rather spectacular, queen takes knight. Obviously, queen takes queen, it would be rook takes rook checkmate. Pawn takes queen, rook takes rook check, queen back, rook takes queen checkmate. And, the only move not to get checkmate is bishop up, but remember we took a piece, so white's the piece up and he just takes the pawn. He wins the game a piece up. So, I guess there were 2 ways to win. Bishop takes knight, and the other move that someone suggested, knight to g5. Very good. Let's go on to the next example. This looks like that checkmate we saw earlier where white played rook to d8. Rook takes rook, rook takes rook, rook back, rook takes, but there's a defense here. It's pretty simple, so I'll just run through it. Rook to d8. A blunder would be rook takes rook, but you have the nice withdrawal of that rook. The rooks protect each other, and actually this is a drawn game. So rook takes rook, rook, and you see that there's 3 pawns on each side, so there's no winning chances for either side. The point that the author's point was that some beginners would fail to realize they could retreat that rook on e4 to e8, which is the key defensive move. Let's see what we have here. Yes, it is black. It's black to play and win. Does anyone see the winning move for black? Notice that the 2 rooks are lined up and would love to play rook to d1 check.
Rook d2?
It's adequately defended right now by rook takes rook, queen takes rook. Rook to d2 doesn't work. See that bishop on f4 that can come back and take it? So the idea is, can you draw the queen away from protecting the d1 square? What move does that for black? Remember that the theme is a back row mate. You want to be headed toward the
This is supposed to be made in one?
no, it may be a series of moves. It only ultimately ends in a mate through the back rank. In this case, white's first rank.
I got a crazy idea.
All right.
What if we go bishop to b5?
Well, that's a good idea. You move the rook, you threaten a discovered attack on the queen. You might do rook to d1 check, but I could give up the queen and get two rooks for my trouble, couldn't I? Two rooks are supposed to be approximately even, so that's not as clear-cut as the author's solution. Anybody have any other ideas?
Threaten the queen, bishop to f3.
Okay, how about pawn takes bishop? And that gives me an escape square for my king. You're going to have a hard time checkmating me on the back row. All right, now remember I said think about drawing the white queen away. The queen's protecting d1. What other square is the queen protecting?
Protecting f2, f3.
And on the queen side? b2. Queen takes b2 is the solution. Queen takes queen, she no longer guards the d1 square, and the rook down leads to checkmate. And the threat is queen takes queen.
What if you move your queen to that?
There, that's the checkmate. Okay, let's go on to the next one. White has the two rooks lined up on that d6 pawn. Black has the rook and queen lined up on the e file. But the white king can retreat if he has to. The white king can move up to that hole h2 behind the h pawn. That tells me that this is white to play and win. See how the black king is stuck behind his three pawns? So if we can get back there, it would be checkmate.
Bishop takes.
Yeah, I think we have to lower our sights a little bit. I don't see an immediate way to break through and get checkmate. So,
Pawn to f4.
well, that leaves the bishop unprotected, and black could do rook takes bishop.
Protected by the queen.
Well, but the rook is protected by the black queen. So, but the idea is good. f4, the idea is to drive the rook away. How about if we just move that bishop to f4? Then we have the bishop and the queen and the two rooks lined up on that d6 pawn, don't we? I think that d6 pawn is a goner. And once we get down there, maybe we can break through. So let's look at bishop to f4. Oh, no, it's not bishop to f4. It's bishop to h6, threatening checkmate. The reason this works, see how the queen actually could take the bishop, but that leaves the rook on e5 protected by the pawn, but the pawn is pinned by the two rooks, so we have queen takes rook, pawn takes, rook check would be checkmate. So queen takes bishop, queen takes rook wins the exchange, and rook takes pawn to follow is an easy ending to win. So that's the move. I forgot about it. Bishop to h6. That is a great move. Now there is a defense to the checkmate. Besides queen takes, it's pawn here. Now, white gets a winning position with that. With bishop back, my idea. See, so the bishop now g6 weakened the pawns around the black king. See, all those black squares are very weak. Now the bishop comes back and white wins that d6 pawn. Check. And we use our little escape hatch I talked about. The king moves up. And there's nothing black can do to save the pawn. And white's a pawn up. Black has some drawing chances because of a bishop of opposite colors. So it goes, the queen drops back. The best, if rook takes pawn, that helps black defend because rook takes rook. With the rook off the board, there's less attacking chances. So he takes with the bishop to keep the rooks on the board, at least for a few moves. Now the queen takes the pawn on c4. Now there's a good move here. Bishop attacks the rook. What happens if the rook does rook takes rook? What's the winning move for white? Queen to b8 check. King to g7. What's the next move? Eight. Checkmate. Very good. So he can't do rook takes rook, so he just moves over. Then we see how the bishop is on f6 in those, I told you those black squares around the pawns are weak. If white can get his queen to h6, it'll be checkmate. Queen comes here. Rook comes up here. Now black tries to trade. Pawn up, queen here, forcing the bishop back. This is the end of the analysis. So black has some drawing chances because of bishops of opposite colors, and white's only a pawn up. Anyway, white has a fairly good advantage, but he may not be able to win. Let's go on to the next example. Okay, this position is roughly even. The pawns are even. Both sides have two minor pieces. Black's rooks are better developed than white because he has both rooks out. White has the rook stuck on f1 behind a pawn. White's pawn position is not as good as black. See how that pawn on c3 is by itself? That's an isolated pawn. That's a weakness in the ending. And the pawn on a2 is an isolated pawn. But given the fact that everything else counterbalances, white can probably hold. So it's probably a drawn position until black makes a couple mistakes. The first mistake is knight here. Black tries to start an attack, but his king is still behind those three pawns, you see. It's safer not to move the knight yet. What would be a good move for black in this position? Not to win the game, just a defensive move. What would be a good black move? What could black do to alleviate the fact that his king is stuck behind three pawns? Can he make a hole for himself? Yeah, h6. h6 is the right move. It takes away all white's attacking chances, and it should be a draw, and black may be a little better. Black neglected to do that and started to try to attack and trade pieces. He played knight to e5. Now he does threaten knight takes bishop check, but look, the white rook on d1 and the queen on g5 are attacking that rook on d8, which is defended by the rook, the black rook on e1 and the queen. But also note that the bishop on b7 is attacked. So white's going to try to draw the queen away and then play rook takes rook on d8. So white plays bishop takes bishop. That takes away the threat, knight takes bishop check. And if queen takes bishop, now I can win with rook takes rook. Black makes a blunder here. Black can still draw the position. What's the drawing move for black? Anybody have an idea? I'll tell you the idea. The idea is, how can black block that diagonal from the queen to the rook? Once that diagonal is blocked, it takes away the threat. Rook takes rook, rook takes rook, queen takes rook. What's the move? F6. Yes, he should have played F6, reaching a drawn position. Instead, he did rook takes rook, and queen takes, and now we have queen takes knight, and the back row's undefended. So that's kind of cute. This position is interesting. Notice that the queen and the white queen and rook are headed toward king bishop 7, but it's defended by the black queen. Now the author thinks this is a win for white, but the computer, which wasn't around when the author made his example back in 1935, the computer has a defense. So let's guess what white's first move is. The idea is to cut the defensive line of the queen on c4 to the pawn on f7. Who sees that move? Right. Now the author makes a mistake and he thinks that black is lost. He actually says black's best move is to sacrifice the queen for the rook. Queen takes rook check, and obviously that's going to lose because you can't give up a queen and only get a rook. But there is a defense. Who would... Knight takes knight. That's what the author plays. And let's run through that because that's kind of cute. Queen takes pawn check, king over, pawn up, threatening the queen. Queen drops back to c3. Bishop here, check. Bishop here. Now the bishop's pinned, right? And the king's wedged on behind pawns in the middle of the board. We sack our queen and get a checkmate because the bishop can't go back and defend it. So, knight takes knight doesn't work, but there is a defense. Would anyone like to guess at the defense? It's tricky. I didn't see it myself. The computer's better than we are, actually, so. No, I'm going to show it to you. The threat is queen takes pawn check. The pawn can't be defended. If you can't defend the pawn, can you advance the pawn to a better square, not allowing the queen next to the king?
F5.
F5. And surprisingly enough, it's defended by the knight, so if pawn takes, then the knight would be free, and we could either do queen takes or knight takes, winning the game. The best white can do now is get a draw, and it goes like this. Pawn here, queen takes pawn, knight takes pawn check, knight takes rook, rook to g8 attacking g2 with the queen and rook threatening checkmate. Bishop up to block the line of the queen. Knight comes out, preventing the white knight from retreating to c7. e4 takes f5, and the queen retreats to the diagonal. And the computer says this is an even position. And I just stopped here. So it was a bust on our author's example. Kind of interesting, though. Okay, just a couple more. This one is easy, so we can go through it really quickly. Notice that the king is in a very bad spot on f8, and that the rook is on g8, preventing the king from going to g8 and retreating away. Notice that that diagonal from the king to the pawn, a3 pawn, that black diagonal is open, and that white queen could go to b4, queen to b4 check. Notice that the white rooks are lined up so the white rooks are ready to pound rook to d8 at the right moment. So what's the winning move for white? Well, that's an interesting idea, but if rook takes, where's your checkmate? I can go to e7 with my king. Well, not really, because you would have the other rook to d7 would be checkmate, because the king can't go to e6 because of the bishop. So rook takes queen doesn't cut it.
Queen to b4.
Queen to b4 is the author's solution. Queen takes pawn is interesting. I'd have to look at it some more. Queen back. Now we have that. So this would be a possibility. But then the bishop comes here. This is kind of pretty. Check. Pawn comes up. Bishop takes pawn check. Pawn can't take the bishop because we'd have queen takes rook check. Queen takes. Rook takes the e pawn because the queen doesn't protect it. And the king can't go to f8 and can't go to the d file, so the queen has to block the check. What's the winning move for white?
Queen b5.
No, not queen b5.
Queen a.
Well, rook takes queen check would probably win, but the author says queen to d6, threatening the rook, and rook takes queen takes pawn check, and the queen would be on the other rook, you see. So the rook to d6, the queen to d6 is stronger because we get the queen into the attack, and we win a tempo by attacking the rook on b8, which is unprotected. All right, let's go on to our next example. I think white wins, but rook here. Yeah, it depends on, black makes a mistake. Queen to f3, f6, this should be a draw. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn on b7, still a draw. Rook down, threatening queen takes pawn on b7. Now black, let's see. Oh, black attacks the queen. By attacking the queen, it sets up a trap, and white falls right into it. White needs to retreat the queen. There's two good squares for the queen. The queen could go to g3. See how it would protect the pawn on f2, which is a weak point. The black rook and the black queen are attacking the f2. So queen to g3 would hold that, but then the rook could come down to the second rank and swing across. So you'd have threatened rook takes pawn. There's a better move than queen to g3. The right move for white is queen to d6, and it's better because the queen, if the rook goes to c2, it would leave the rook on f8. We could do queen takes f8 checkmate. So let me show you what the white got greedy and took the pawn. That's a blunder. What's the winning move for black? Right. Queen takes f2. Rook takes check, check, checkmate. This is our last example. Then I got a problem. I don't know if we'll have time to do the problem, but we'll try. I think we need to make some moves. Let's see what happens. Rook here. Queen down to d7. Now the queen is on the rook on e8. Rook takes rook. What's the winning move for white?
Queen takes e8.
Right. Queen to e8. Rook takes. Rook takes. Bishop back. Now what's the winning move?
Bishop e7.
Bishop to e7. Don't forget, queen takes rook check is threatened.
Rook d8.
Rook to d8 would probably win. I don't see how black could defend. But there's a prettier move. Watch this move. Rook takes bishop check. And rook here is checkmate. Even better than rook there first. Okay, well that'll do it for tonight. Thanks for coming.